Welcome to The Cow Behind the Barn, a podcast exploring humanity, the world, and the divine as experienced and interpreted by an artist. I'm Kevin Caldwell, a co-founder of the Table Collective. What does quantum physics have to say about whether things that are not human beings, might be conscious in some way? That's my aim in this episode. But first, when I'm in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, working my way up the switchbacks on a trail that winds its way up and over a high pass, I like to stop and look back at where I've come from. Okay, let me be honest, like is not really the right word, or not the only right word, because truth be told, as I've gotten older, it's become necessary, physically, to pause more often. But I don't like to do it too often, because it can be discouraging how slow the progress seems. However, if I stay focused on each section of the trail and the next turn and the next and the next, and so on, it can actually be surprising how far I get in between pauses. I'm having that sort of experience right now. I paused and I looked back over the weeks that have passed since I launched this podcast, and it hit me. I'm getting ready to record the 21st episode. As I did so, I decided then to take a little time here to share what I see as I retrace the trail, so to speak, up to this point. So retracing my steps. Back down there at the bottom of this trail, I can see the starting point where I wasn't sure what I was going to do, or exactly how I would go about it, or even if anyone would ever listen. At the time, I decided it was worth the effort to send out whatever butterfly effects I could muster, and I trusted that somehow the trail would open in front of me, and that in the process of walking forward, the path would reveal itself. On one of the first turns in the trail, back in episode 2, I wanted to introduce myself to future listeners, so I asked, where and when did I begin? I thought that would be a simple question that would only require maybe a portion of a single episode to answer. And although I suppose that I have somewhat introduced myself in the process of here and there sharing a good bit about myself in various episodes, the question actually ended up being more than a simple way to tell you who I am. If you've been following along, you know that the question ended up forming the shape of the podcast itself. So asking where did I begin sparked me to explore where in terms of what the nature of the cosmos is, which is where we all find ourselves. Asking when did I begin sparked me to explore when by asking about the nature of time itself. Those two topics covered 15 episodes. And then, starting with episode 16, I began exploring where and when did I begin, and as a result, the nature of the self and consciousness emerged. Now, I didn't begin with myself. I didn't even begin with human beings, for that matter, when I started looking at consciousness. I began with various versions of this question. Is anything conscious? Is everything conscious? And if so, in what way or what ways? And I brought in a whale and a rainforest and a rock. The whale, I told about an experience in the life of Nan Hauser, president of the Center for Cetacean Research, as she was filming underwater, and a sperm whale protected her from a killer whale, exhibiting something that many whale researchers have noted in whales: altruistic behavior, empathy, consciousness. The rainforest. I mentioned that in New Zealand, a law was passed granting legal personhood to a rainforest. Person? Consciousness? And then the rock. I talked about a story I wrote back when I was 18 or 19, a story about a rock on the side of a mountain, a story written from the rock's point of view, imagining what it would be like for the rock to have thoughts and memories, consciousness. Now, along the way, I decided not to try to define consciousness, but rather to describe it. My description involved the interplay of experience and awareness as two factors in how I understand consciousness. In summary, that description involves different dimensions of consciousness, ranging from when a subject has things happen to them, which is what I call experiencing those events or stimuli, but that subject is not aware. That's one dimension. To then having when something does experience something and is aware of having that experience, and then to when something is also aware of being aware. And then I also imagined a dimension of consciousness in which a subject or a something or a being is being aware in the first person of what others experience and are aware of. Now, so far, I've not focused on human beings, as I've said, but only on what often are referred to as inanimate objects. And I use that word for convenience, but I don't actually like the term. When something is called inanimate, this already presumes something about its consciousness, because inanimate suggests that the thing being referred to is not animated. In other words, does not possess something like a soul, is not conscious. I made the choice to begin by exploring which things in the universe might have consciousness and what type of consciousness that might be. Which of my dimensions, in other words, might apply to it. In the last 3 episodes, I've been asking how different religions might see this question of whether non-human objects have any sort of consciousness. So I drew from 7 sources: animism, the Gita, Buddha, Lao Tzu, and then the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim religions. And I summarized the results of that exploration of those religious sources with phrases like this: in one way or another, we live in a world that is alive. There is consciousness everywhere around us. And somehow consciousness of some sort, in some way, is connected to everything or most things. And the cosmos is humming with consciousness. And finally, I wrote and said, the cosmos is alive, or is brimming with what is alive, in some mysterious but very real way. And it feels to me like this is a good place to include a poem I've shared previously. The poem is called Rippling Skies, and it expresses this sense of a cosmos in which everything in some way is humming and brimming with consciousness, vibrant with life. Rippling skies. I turn my eyes. The sky ripples, canopy of lights glowing, red, growing, slowing, dying, already dead. Seeds in the cinders of stars, worlds of worlds in an ember. Every pregnant ash, a fullness of empty vastness, a point of ripening intensity, density of verdant heat, explosive power. Every burst births a cycle, expanding, despanding, unspanding, respanding, expanding again, universes begetting universes. Beside, within, before, after are the words that we agree to use, as if we know. Words are flotsam, floating atop inscrutable, unfathomable seas, teeming with creatures frolicking with gleeful disregard for the laws of our pragmatic, reassuring, necessary grammar. But really? Every world is a where with no there, and a there with no where, in a when with no then, a then with no when. We live as we live because we must live as if we live in place and time, with these people and plants and pets and problems, as if all of this, in fact, works the way it seems to work, the way we need it to work, need to believe it works in order to set foot outside a door on a winter morning or to see and name in wonder a setting sun. Because this is the only way I can live, as this I who lives this way. But really? I carry in myself and am myself carried by. Universes begetting universes. Expanding, despanding, unspanding, respanding, expanding again. Every burst birthing in a cycle, a density of verdant heat, explosive power, a point of ripening intensity, a fullness of empty vastness. Every pregnant ash, worlds of worlds in an ember. Seeds in the cinders of stars, already dead. slowing, dying, red, growing, a canopy of lights glowing in the rippling sky. I turn my eyes. How is the cosmos brimming with consciousness? What does that mean? The religious heritages we explored all answer this differently and then raise new questions about it. Is there a single supreme divine being, for example? Do multiple spirits that have consciousness and are somehow united with but distinct from the objects they're associated with account for some evidence of consciousness in things? Is there some sort of collective consciousness in which all things somehow exist? These heritages, again, differ in how they would answer such questions, but agree that somehow consciousness of some sort in some way is connected to everything and vice versa. Now, I started with religion, and I want to turn next to ask about physics and philosophy and what they have to say. Some physicists say that photons exhibit behaviors that they deem indicative of consciousness. When photons are fired at a background with or without an observer, photons seem to be able to tell whether they're being observed, in the sense that the fact of being measured and observed affects how they, quote-unquote, behave. Physicists don't agree on the meaning or the implications of that, but that's what the experiments show. The discussion of the implications of what modern physics has discovered about subatomic particles has affected philosophical conversations, because the physics speaks to what's been a major fault line in philosophical consideration of these questions about consciousness. For example, is consciousness a result of something in the material world? Chemically determined brain functions, for example, or is it a non-material reality apart from matter? And which came first, the chicken or the egg? More and more, based on quantum theories of the cosmos, some philosophers, instead of explaining consciousness in terms of it having a dependent relationship with matter, postulate that consciousness exists beyond the realm of biology. And rather than seeing consciousness as emerging from matter, they speculate it may be the other way around. That's not a new conversation in philosophy, but it has taken on new dimensions based on physics. Therefore, I'm going to look at physics first, and then come back to philosophy in the next episode, and then we'll circle back to religion. So I'm back to quantum physics. What are the implications of physics for understanding the nature of consciousness, especially in relationship to objects like rocks and plants, etc.? Relative to this topic, quantum mechanics aims, mathematics as it were, at explaining the counterintuitive, apparently random behaviors of subatomic particles. What physicists noted in particular has been the impact of observation upon things being observed. As I mentioned above, when the activities of subatomic particles were measured or observed, their behaviors, quote-unquote, changed. Seeking to understand this dynamic is to a large extent what has led physicists to articulate what might be considered the first principles of quantum theory, and there are three: indeterminacy, complementarity, and superposition. So let me talk about those. Indeterminacy. One of the core principles of quantum theory is that physical reality is inherently uncertain and imprecise. Let me clarify two things about this term, indeterminacy, as it's used in this connection. Quantum indeterminacy is different from being vague or unclear. Second, physicists don't mean that quantum indeterminacy is due to a lack of measuring ability or precision in measurements. In quantum usage, indeterminacy is a fundamental aspect of nature. Things happen and act and behave in unpredictable, uncertain, indeterminate ways. The so-called double-slit experiment demonstrated that two electrons shot from the same position with the same velocity will generally end up in different places. Now, most of us, at least I would assume that the actions of two identical things in two identical situations should result in identical outcomes, unless they have the ability to choose. subatomic particles act as if they have that ability, as if they're making choices. Making the observation that this is the case was one thing, but understanding why is another, both for physicists and philosophers. But let me turn to complementarity. What's known as the Heisenberg uncertainty principle explains the impossibility of knowing both the position and the velocity of a subatomic particle. Both of those are, of course, qualities that we would use in trying to measure or determine something about a subatomic particle, like, where is it and how fast is it moving? But what the Heisenberg uncertainty principle says is you can't observe and measure both velocity and position. One or the other, but not both. An observer then would need to make a decision about what to observe. The principle of complementarity means that certain pairs of properties, waves, particles, or position and momentum, as I've just mentioned, can't be simultaneously observed and measured. And yet both members of those pairings are necessary for a complete understanding of quantum phenomena. Hence, they're complementary to one another, but impossible to measure at the same time. Because these aspects can't be observed simultaneously, and since to make such observations requires particular ways of setting up an experiment, the behavior of the quantum objects being observed in such experiments is then intrinsically linked to the experimental setup used to observe them, and thus to the decision made by the observers about what to observe. So once again, the act of observation influences the observed properties. Both indeterminacy and complementarity force us to question some of our widely held notions of reality and knowledge, at least as we commonly think about the world. The quantum world is not as straightforward as our everyday experience suggests. And perhaps nowhere is this divergence between what we think and what actually is real as clear as in the description of the third core principle of quantum theory, superposition. The theory of superposition, or the principle of superposition, developed from the implications of the role that observation and measurement plays in the two principles that we've looked at so far, indeterminacy and complementarity. Let me put it sort of simplistically like this. If observation affects how particles act, then we don't know what they are or how they act when they're not being observed or measured, which means they might be something other than what we come to know them to be once they are measured or observed. The normal way we assume things to be is that, of course, it was already this thing doing that thing that I now observe. The only thing that changes is in me because I'm observing it now. But according to quantum theory, subatomic particles change behavior upon observation, which means that they were something else, or at least acting differently prior to that. What was it? We don't know because we didn't observe it. If observation is a catalyst that changes what a particle does, then reality is a reciprocal entanglement between the observed and the observer. In fact, according to some interpretations of this basic point, superposition means that a quantum particle exists in all possible states simultaneously until a measurement is made, at which point the particle collapses into a single definite state, essentially choosing one of the possible states based on probability, perhaps. This is often described as the particle being in a mixed state until observed, where it can occupy multiple potential states at once. That theory is obviously rigorously debated, and the science of it all is above my pay grade and beyond the scope of my main focus, which is to seek to grasp what quantum physics might suggest about my questions related to the consciousness of things, non-human things. But the main ingredient, if you will, of superposition is that it emphasizes the role of the observer in determining the state of a thing, of a quantum system. This, of course, raises philosophical questions about the nature of reality itself. Summarizing the implications of the three core principles here, I'd say this. Given the interplay of particles and observation and the apparent random nature of it, and the way that an observer changes outcomes, It seems that the universe is an unfolding reality and that it unfolds, at least in part, as a response to consciousness, and seems to unfold as if it is conscious itself. Now, I'm going to start wrapping up, but I want to make some comments about the conclusions that I'm coming to at this point. Things may change, of course, but this is where I am now as I'm processing all this material. My approach to the question of consciousness and whether a thing such as a rock, or perhaps better, the particles which make up a rock, might be conscious is not to define consciousness in ontological terms, but in what I would call behavioral, descriptive terms. So not in terms of what it is, but in how it functions and how it acts. And because subatomic particles behave as if they're responding to, reacting to, being observed, and thus change under observation, I'm comfortable saying that at least some non-human things act as if they're conscious. So it seems to me that consciousness is not a singularly human feature at this level, this dimension that I'm talking about. Now, I did use whales as an example. Many of us, I think, are comfortable with associating consciousness with animals and mammals and intelligent beings like whales. We find that natural to assume. But I also used the rainforest that was given legal status with the rights of a person because plants exhibit aspects of personhood, such as apparently memory and the ability to learn and to communicate, among other things. Perhaps a different type of consciousness than animals, or at least that seems obvious to me at any rate, but still they exhibit behaviors we would associate with consciousness. Now, I think fewer people would say plants are conscious when asked that question directly. For example, do you think plants are conscious? However, if we were given a description first, such as, here's this thing that adapts and learns and communicates, and then we asked, is it conscious? I think it's likely many would say yes. Well, those qualities are true of plants. So maybe granting the legal status of personhood to a rainforest is not as odd as it might seem to some. Well, what about rocks? As I've said, quantum physics suggests subatomic particles do act as if rocks do act as if they have consciousness. And subatomic particles make up rocks. So yeah, I have to be open to concluding that rocks might be conscious, at least in this way of behaving as if they make choices, etc., at least at the subatomic particle level. I've referred in my description of the dimensions of consciousness to things as subjects. For example, I refer to consciousness as including when a subject experiences such and such. I think quantum physics speaks to this. Since subatomic particles are affected by observations and experiments conducted by human beings and act in ways we would normally associate with conscious entities, then I can say that particles behave in ways in which subjects, not just objects, behave. In other words, the objects of observation are also subjects, which react to being observed. It also seems clear from all of this that consciousness and reality are entangled, and thus it follows, for me at least, that if the things in the universe are not conscious themselves, they are at least deeply connected with consciousness in some form. And that brings me back to that word entanglement. In earlier episodes, based on insights from quantum physics about the nature of the physical makeup of the cosmos, which is our where, I frequently referred to the term entanglement because I learned it from quantum physics. At this stage, I'm only noting the implications for the way that things might be entangled with each other at a subatomic particle level. I should say at that stage, that's what I was noting, the implications for the way that things might be entangled with each other at a subatomic particle level, with each other. But one of the poems that I shared at that stage to illustrate that point seems fitting here because it also expresses in an imaginative mode the way that non-human things and consciousness might be entangled. At that time, I didn't delve deeply into the entanglement with consciousness. but it seems very timely now, so I am going to present again my poem, Hunting. Hunting. I run, gun in hand, behind panting hounds that flow like floodwater through the oaks. I follow, my mind full of the scene I will find. A snarling terror pinned against a tree, the dogs who will part as I raise the polished steel, the eyes of my prey when I take my aim. I arrive. There's already blood on the ground and in the teeth of hounds, and plastered into the fur of the cornered beast, a hare. I lower the barrel, stoop to a knee, touch a patch of the red chalky dust, put a finger to my tongue, and taste the musky, metallic, living animal heat. The hair is longer up my arms, wiry on my legs, bristling down my back. I hear, smell, see, fear, flee, stumble in the dust, gasping heart, limbs burning, dart right, leap. There are teeth ripping, a sudden fire. Legs fail. There is wood. A tree. I turn. A man. He's on a knee, a finger to his lips. I stand beneath the tree, gun on the ground. The beast is still. Drying blood turns to flakes of rust on a fallen leaf. In the poem, in addition to exploring the entanglement of particles and the entanglement of non-human things with consciousness, I think I was also imaginatively seeking to create a sense of connection and thus empathy with the rabbit. Such empathy with things and plants and animals, not to mention humans, can change how we relate to and treat the world around us. And that begins to lead us to the realm of ethics, which may not be what we normally think about when we're asking questions of quantum physics and the nature of non-human objects. But there are ethical implications for how we view the consciousness of other things and beings. By which I mean primarily that when we assume something is conscious, we tend naturally to feel more empathy and compassion, and thus treat it, or them, differently. That'll be something I'm sure we'll come back to in the future. I raised it a few episodes ago. I'm just noting it again. Now, I'm tempted at this stage to begin comparing what physics says about the cosmos and consciousness with what my explorations of religion surfaced. And I do see a compatibility between Eastern religious views, especially Buddhist views in quantum physics. In fact, I'm discovering elements, however, in all of the religious heritages I've explored that seem to be supportive of and supported by quantum physics. This is why I take the view that the religious or spiritual way of knowing and the way of knowing that I see in physics are different, but each important ways of knowing. I believe that each way of knowing is able to inform and enlighten and correct and supplement and broaden the other. We need them all. However, before doing a more extensive comparison, I want to do an episode in which I bring philosophy into the conversation. As mentioned earlier, physics raises philosophical questions, and especially in recent years, quantum theories have influenced philosophical discussion in important ways. It makes sense, then, to turn to philosophy in the next episode. So, until next time.